Thanks.
Oh yeah, I'm Sila. She, they. Yeah.
Alex, he or they?
All right. Okay. Thank you, the panelists. Now, to the teams, starting from OG, you can just introduce yourselves and speak positions and gender pronouns if you wish to say.
Hi, I'm Jerome. I'm going to be PM. No preferred gender pronoun.
I'm Evan. I'm the DPM. No gender pronoun preference.
All right. Opening opposition.
I'm the first speaker. My name is Keisha Sandiono, and my preferred gender pronouns are she, her.
I'm Joshua Tandiono. My preferred gender pronouns are he, him.
All right. CG.
I'm Atsushi, and no gender pronoun.
I'm Toshiya Ozawa. No preferred gender pronoun.
All right. CO.
Hi, I'm Wee-Ern. No preferred gender pronoun.
Hi, I'm Avinash. No preferred gender pronoun.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for the introduction. Now, without further ado, I'll call upon Prime Minister. Here. Yeah, just time yourself as well. Thanks.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Chair, when you have the two most populous countries in the world at the neck of conflict with one another, engaged, already embroiled in a world where there is a lexicon of problems surrounding both countries' economies, we say that it is immoral and it is unjust to engage in an escalation of this conflict. We say it is regrettable that the 20 soldiers died, but the real facts of why the 20 soldiers died is because of this escalation of constant conflict. This was not a new problem that came up, where 20 soldiers were protecting a border. This was 20 soldiers being sent in to defend continuous rising tensions and an ignorance to provide the fact that China will not back down to this. Okay, what do we mean by de-escalation? We say we'll engage in acts of diplomacy. We'll gain clear clarifications as to what we can and cannot do, and we do not mind being submissive in this territory. So in the instance of the Galwan Valley, which we think is in dispute, we are fine with retreating from that valley after intense negotiation and agreements to China that it will not infringe on further territory of India. We will also are fine with militarily defending borders that are retreated from that area. Notice that this is a disputed area and its historical significance has been both claimed to be Chinese and Indian. It is also a relatively small area that is high up in the mountains and does not have many people in it. It is not that much of like a populous area. Also, we are fine with the alternatives of issues like sanctions, anything that requires things like de-escalation, like shaming China in this community. We are willing to act militarily as far as it infringes on the rest of the populace of India, the part that nobody, like literally nobody lives in the Galwan Valley. We are actually fine with that. In positioning, the metrics by which we will decide this debate, in order for me not to get swept up by closings, is because which side can maintain the most consequential amount of life in this conflict. So we say that it is about stability, it is about maintaining to a certain extent the sovereignty, and we're going to prove to you how exactly you can maintain sovereignty in a sensible way that does not infringe on the actual benefits and lives of these individuals. So I have three things to bring to you today. One, how Chinese hegemon will never let you win. Two, how this escalation actually look like. And three, why are we still able to defend our borders even if we back down from this location? Any clarifications? Okay, so one, why Chinese hegemon will never lead to you being able to win this conflict. We do not have to prove, in instance, that China will always win We think that in instances of all-out war, it's kind of unpredictable who would exactly win, but we're going to tell you that it's a very, very high burden for India to pay. Reason being, number one, the calculus of Chinese intelligence and Chinese military is not one where they will ever back down to your demands. So we have to know, in terms of trend analysis, the Gawan Valley is very near to the Aksai River. It is somewhere which China considers a strategic position in order to protect things like, water, like things like protecting certain interests which lead to their expansionist claims of being able to hold that historical area. It is a value of like historical importance for China. But trend analysis also shows that in places of dispute, like Hong Kong, like Tibet, like Tiananmen, they don't even stop in the instances where US is willing to threaten security laws on their locations, on the autonomous locations within those areas. We say this is an undeterrable threat that you're not going to solve with the further backup of your Indian military. So if you do, we have to understand that there are two prongs in which China still owns over you. Economically, they are far, far more stable than you, and they are the second largest GDP in the world. They can outlast you with the amount of money that comes in and to bleed you dry. But secondly, the Chinese military is also double the amount of the Indian military, right? In terms of like, not even just like ICBMs, which we don't really think will be used, but in terms of just like ground mass and like on the ground tactics and weapons, even if you can't use weapons in the Gawan Valley, the Chinese soldiers attach nails to their backs in order to fact that they know that they have to die for this. They are willing to die in that calculus. Second thing, it is very expensive and India is in no position to prevent against this kind of stuff. The amount of troops and money it takes to divert into the Indian military to upscale to combat the Chinese military is nothing compared. It will damage their economy. 3 reasons why. China and COVID. The COVID-19 virus means that China has handled it and maintained it significantly much better than a lot of the world, while India is struggling because of their lack of like funds to be able to provide for the homeless in the streets. Millions and millions upon individuals dying, and that like risks a lot of things, right? It risks things like election, like emotional, like stability. We think it's best interest of Modi to try to keep into account of his election stability. Second thing, the Indian nuclear spill is also something that happened in which they're unable to contain, right? And the third thing is there's like intense Muslim and Hindu riots within their regions, within Mumbai itself, where the policemen use lathis to beat up Muslim soldiers. We think all of these things show you that India is a bleeding pot that cannot have a control on its conflict. Impact, we don't need the Galwan Valley. So make no mistake, it is no Kashmir. The significance of this area is largely historical, and we will equate this to you letting individuals die because you want to protect a significant masculinity macho claim. This escalation looks like the fact that you mean more death, but on a consequential level, you dirty the relations between the two countries entirely. So the bleeding ground is China has a significant amount of funds and investment invested into India itself. This means trading things like Huawei technology, trading things like, being able to aid them in COVID virus. They sent over 100,000 masks. These are all supplies that Indian authorities need much, much more. So how are we still able to back down and still maintain that same amount of sovereignty? I think it is principally all right to back down because of the fact that the lives of the people, it matter more than any land or jurisdiction that you have. There is an understanding and a memorandum within governments that the lives of your individuals mean the most to you, right? So the 20 soldiers guarding an area was a sacrifice of that life. Why is this important? Because the Aksai River is further from any Chinese city than it is closer to any Indian city. The lives are at stake on your side as an Indian authority. 3 reasons why we uphold that life. 1, we don't actually infringe on any Indian citizens' lives. So we give up the Galwan Valley, we don't actually give up like much of anything. It does not contribute to the GDP. It does not contribute to the well-being of the lives of individuals within that. If there's someone in there, I don't mind moving them to like, let's say a different city, right? But the numbers are very sparse. In fact, I think there's like 5 different people in there. The only thing which like to claim for is the historical importance of that region. Second thing, the principle to die is overrode by the harm that you can cause to other individuals. So me wanting to fight and die for India, regardless of if it's what the people want, its proximity to the countries, the proximity to the cities within the country mean that I'm putting everyone else at risk and I'm numerating everybody into my conflict. We think that is unjust in of itself. And the third thing is a path of clarity with China allows India to remain all of these benefits, COVID-19 aid, of technological trade. Notice that as a booming and grounding economy, it is the best interest of India to want to galvanize all of these issues. ultimately, Chair, what opposition has to prove to you today to win this debate is why exactly this Galwan Valley is willing to support everything. And like, if it is true that it is so important in terms of resources, but it does not cater to the dominations of the most vulnerable citizens in India, why then do you still cater towards it? Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. Now call upon Leader of Opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
20 soldiers might die on our side of the house, but 20,000 more Indians die under proposition side of the house the moment they allow China, who's an opportunist and a very big hegemony, to further their concessions, right? To further attack these kinds of Indian territory and to further subject these kinds of Indian individuals to worse off lives. I think that their whole case falls the moment they only want to rely on this principle of like saving more lives, right? Because we think that this principle is, this debate is not about you sacrificing your land to create more lives, but it's about how to actually maintain the best sort of lives for these kinds of Indian society and the types of lives that they will face under Chinese power and under Chinese control. We think that that is the moment where you make Indians have to give up a lot of their rights, a lot of their autonomy to China. I don't think that this is something that the Indian society wants. Two arguments today that I'll bring today in debate. First of all, why it increases China's power in the Sino-Indian conflict. Second of all, why concessions further harm Indian society as a whole. All my rebuttals will be integrated within my issues. So firstly, let's look at the idea why this increases China's power. The fact that PM said that China's a hegemony and willing to take countries like Hong Kong and Tibet means that we should not increase Chinese hegemony and their power, right? Because the principle of it's okay to sacrifice your land is contingent upon people being safe, and not just people being safe, but the quality of life is also increased. Why does this get harmed under OG, right? Because it sends a symbolic narrative that Indians are okay with giving concessions and okay with giving up their autonomy and control to China. And this will result in China increasing its hegemony and power because they feel that they have the power over India. And why is this so harmful? Because it's very convenient for PM just to say that, oh, it's just giving up like one valley, it's just giving up one river. But no, right? Exactly because they characterize China as powerful, this extends to things like when China is seen as powerful, not just in the face of India, but other countries surrounding India as well. That's the moment India becomes much more dependent on China, right? And that's the moment India will lose more of their territory. Like they lose their access and their control over the Kashmir land that is so important to them. And why is this so bad, right? Because Pakistan right now is already under China's control. Pakistan is already joining the Belt and Road Initiative and is already increasingly dependent on China. The moment India creates that kind of narrative and symbolic narrative that they give concessions towards China, that's the moment they're more likely to lose a lot of the land in Kashmir and lose a lot of their more sacred lands. I don't think that this policy of appeasement and concessions is actually beneficial to them. This is analogous to how in World War I, they gave a policy of appeasement, like what Hitler was doing, and it didn't result in change at all. It resulted in much more antagonism and aggressiveness from Hitler and from China. I don't think that you get a better like Chinese control on your side of the house. But second idea under this issue, right? China just wants to brandish its power like what it did in the South China Sea. And it's not them like creating a full-scale war. That's why when you talk about like 20 soldiers dying, it's completely regrettable, we agree, but it's far better than like, it's not like the threat of a full-scale war is not going to happen like what Prop said. So I think that the fact that you're giving land concessions, which involves citizens living in those lands as well, to Chinese control is extremely bad, because China will back down the moment India does not give concessions. Why? Because it's completely false for them to say that India is not a powerful country and they're like suffering from COVID and that's why they need so much help. I'll deal with this idea that India is strong. 3 reasons why. First of all, realize that because of like a lot of trade war with like Trump and the United States, China's already losing a lot of the support in the international state, and they're already losing a lot financially, economically, right? But second of all, COVID harms China's economy as well, and they harm Chinese. Millions of people in China are also dying. And okay, we understand, even if both sides of the house in India, people are dying too. The difference is the xenophobia of the coronavirus is targeted towards China because of like Trump and because of US anti-sentiments against China. People are already wary against China. It's unlikely that China is going to like engage in a full-scale war within India, even if they don't give concessions. But third of all, I think that the simple fact that India has not joined the Belt and Road Initiative and they're completely fine, they're economically independent, it shows to you that India is not dependent on China and it's financially strong enough to like handle on its own. Every country surrounding India, like Pakistan, Tajikistan, all these kinds of countries are already joining Chinese economic forums and like the Belt and Road Initiative. And this proves that that India is not dependent on China, has their full control, and they don't need to give concessions. Second issue then, why concessions further harm Indian society? First of all, I think if Prop wants to further say that India is like not strong in and of itself, we think that the West will always back up India, right, economically and socially, because they also want to control China. This is how the US and the UK is actively supporting India too, right? But second of all, I think that the threat on our side of the house is very limited because China does not want war either. China does not want global attention to them to become bad because they're doing things like removing out of communism towards starting to like becoming more economically liberal and starting to grow their economy. And by having a large scale conflict, this is not what China wants because they can't afford it economically and it's not in their foreign policy and their interests. But third of all, what will China do with the acquired land, right? And I think that this is the chunk of the debate that I think like OG never characterized. When China acquires the land, they will do exactly what they did in Xinjiang with the Muslim minorities, right? That's why when like PM wants to say that they harm the like Indians has like a Muslim Buddhist conflict in their country, this Hindu conflict, this does not happen, right? Because it harms the Muslims more and it harms minorities more the minute Indian people who live in Tibet are going to be put in Chinese re-education camps, right? Teaching them how to be good citizens and listen to their government. This harms Indian society, and I don't think that we should concede to that. But third of all, territorial concessions means that we lose a lot of the mountainous terrain that we have. It's very easy to defend, and we can't give that up. When you have a lot of mountains, these are strategic locations that China will use to increase their military defense systems, increase their military capabilities, and like these valleys that PM wants to talk about. And that makes it much easier to attack mainland India if they really are so hegemonistic and opportunist, like what PM wants to say. So at the end of the day, you don't get benefits under PM side of the house. But lastly then, why does this create much more political tension and aggressiveness within the Indian government? Because you're attacked further in India, the Modi government is attacked because opposition groups in India will use the rhetoric that we want to reclaim our lost land and they will win. So you increase hostility and the aggressive agenda from these opposition groups to escalate tensions even further. And I think that's why election stability that PM wants to talk about gets much worse under government side of the house. So proud to stand on opening opposition.
All right. Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Now I'll call upon Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
So long as we can prove to you on the side of opening government that the extent to which China increases its power and expansionism on India is limited or close to non-existent, the point in which we make this strategic concession, because China is also self-interested and has trade relations and bilateral trades and interests it has within India. And there's a fine line that China has to thread when they try to reclaim these kinds of territory. And we can tell you that the lives of individuals in India is more safeguarded. We tell you we take the debate. What have we heard from the side of opening opposition? They told us basically two things. They told us that we can't increase the hegemony of China's power in this, and number two, that how the increase in power of China is a concession that China can just expand into Indian territory in the first place. We think number one on the idea of increasing China's power, when they say it's a symbolic narrative, and that this will increase China's hegemony over India and cause them to be weak, and how Pakistan is already under China's control. We already told you that we're perfectly fine defending the borders or defending the areas in which it's actually important and contains human life and loss potentially if China invades into it. Notice the location of the Galwan Valley in the conflicted areas are areas that are inhabitable, areas in mountainous areas. So maybe if it is strategic locations for oversight or stationing camps, for example, these are places we're willing to give up or willing to make concessions to in order to safeguard lives in the future of individuals in other sorts of territory. Why are they unlikely to infringe? My first speaker has already clarified clarified to you that because it's true that China, this is an important gateway for China in order to have a important gateway and strategic land location for China, that the point in which we have this de-escalation, we'll do it diplomatically. So the point in which, or when India concedes to de-escalating and allowing them to have more control over the territory in the Gowan Valley, we tell you it comes at the expense of them also agreeing to not continuously expand. Why are they likely to do this? We think there's trend to show that China has an incentive to want to preserve the relationship within them or not have an escalation of violence, noticing that these are two countries with nuclear capacity and full-out nuclear warfare or infringement on explicit or more land that is actually important to India could lead to thousands upon thousands of lives lost. Notice the current agreement that is in the Gowan Valley. When we have things like no firearms within the area that both sides are unable to use, we think China does have an incentive to not want to engage in escalations of violence, but still want to have this strategic land ownership and claim over. We don't think China is an irrational actor to simply want to do this. And lastly, when they told you how they aren't part of the Belt and Road Initiative, this is also another incentive to not fully invade or destroy India or take over all their land to begin with, because they're an extremely important trading bloc. Extremely important trading bloc to China, and they unlocked a lot of trading potential the point in which they include them in the first place. Now, bringing back what my first speaker has told you, we told you to analyze the current circumstances that we're in COVID-19 and the lack of resources we have as the Indian economy and India as a whole, and whether it's more strategic to want to engage with conflicts with China, even though India, we agree, has a large military, it does not compare to the military might of China when they have the largest defense budget and the largest military in and of itself. When you look at the 20 Indian soldiers that were killed in supposed hand-to-hand combat, what was later revealed was that Chinese soldiers and militia used bats with nails attached to it to beat up these soldiers and kill these individuals. We see no trend of China wanting to stop at anything to get this territory. We think it's best to safeguard these lives and not waste expenditure and resources guarding this territory in the first place. We think noticing there are several structural failures in India that has caused things like the COVID-19 to hit especially hard. And in this time, we need to preserve resources. There are three reasons why COVID-19, especially in India, although it is a global pandemic, why has hit India especially hard in comparison to China. Notice that China, firstly, has relatively passed the first wave. So currently in the disputes, most of these states are relatively low in cases, for example. But in India, they have recently started to enter the first wave or the second wave of the COVID-19. Number one, due to late lockdowns and preventative measures, which increased the spread in these areas in India in the first place. Number two, highly impoverished communities, which means they were extremely susceptible to catching the virus and spreading it to mass amounts of individuals in India. And thirdly, even after eventual lockdown, the Indian government relaxed the measures extremely prematurely. There wasn't a comprehensive SOP, and businesses, for example, had no procedure on how to operate, and there were no mandatory measures set in the government on how to conduct post-COVID-19 or post-lockdown in the first place. We then tell you that India is hit especially hard, especially in the coming weeks, when India is having a mass influxes of COVID-19 infections in the first place. Then why is it important to be on the good side of China? We tell you when there's trends and scientists telling you that the COVID-19 cure is likely to come from China, when a lot of funds from China is funded into these kinds of research, we tell you having that relationship or maintaining that relationship, the point in which the cure comes about, is extremely important to India, to its population in the first place, and we think you have a duty there. But also to tell you why, or to prove the link as to why it is that China has to maintain or has some incentive to maintain relationships with this. Notice that China exports large amounts, or one of the largest amounts of rice, for example, or food produce in the world to maintain its the largest population in the world. And noticing this, India exports one of the most amounts, is the biggest producer of wheat and rice, for example, that China directly imports from India in the first place. We think there are several levels of incentives to tell you that China isn't simply going to invade all of India, the point in which you make one strategic concession in the first place. And then they told you in OO that they have an international reputation to maintain. There are two problems with this. Number one, a lot of countries are interdependent on China for exports and extremely cheap goods to provide for their country in the very first place. We think that the Chinese economy branches out into everything when a lot of countries all around the world export from this country, and it's unlikely for them to want to get involved in the conflict and side with India in instances in which they do. And secondly, on OO, what they told you is that China wants to maintain its international perception and they want to see it as the global, like the peacekeeper, for example. We see no trend in this, and this is simply an assertion. Look at these Spratly Islands currently during the COVID-19 situation. We see China using this opportunity to invade into the islands in Spratly Islands. We tell you these are problems that tell you that China is unwilling to back down even within the pandemic, and they have no maintenance of reputation in the first place because they already have a global hegemon and everyone's interdependent. We tell you the trend to show you this tells you that it's important for India to make a strategic concession now before it's too late and all-out warfare happens. We have to prioritize the Indian economy and people on the ground, and we have to save them in the end of the day. Proud to propose.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are. All right, thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now I invite Member of Gov.
Panel, wait, sorry. Okay, I'll tie myself. Panel, just listen to their rhetoric, because they just want us to be friends with China, because we're going to get cures from China, because everyone loves China and they're a part of their Belt and Road Initiative. Well, here's the deal. As India, we are not dependent on China. The vast majority of Indian trade is with the UK because of like historical ties with like the West, right? That is the reason why India is not dependent on China, and we don't need all of China to give up the cure because we can get American vaccines. I'll talk about three things in this debate. One, what the Sino-Indian conflict actually looks like, and why this is a conflict which does not pose an active threat to India. Two, I'll talk about the comparative and why more deaths happen on their side of the house the moment China's more retaliatory. And three, I'll talk about Indian society and why they're going to vote in politicians who are more likely to go against China and reclaim their territory. Let's first talk about the Sino-Indian conflict and why this is a conflict we can win. Because let's just take a bit of a history lesson, right? Because there was a Sino-Indian war in 1962 in Aksai Chin, right? There was a war here which resulted in an Indian victory. Now let's talk about the structural analysis as to why that will repeat itself. One, because if we look at the incentive structure of China, they do not want an economic war. They do not want a war because all they want is economic power. Look at the current trade war between China and the US. The reason why China never insults Trump or like tries to go against Trump is because they want a better trade deal, because they want to grow their economy. Look at their $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative. All of those efforts like that China is currently doing are all points to like their desire to be a global economic hegemon, right? Look at their $60 billion investment in Africa. They necessarily do not want war with India, and therefore like tensions will not escalate to a massive extent like what they want to talk about. But two, let's just take a bit of a history lesson, right? Because the terrain that we're talking about, like these territories we're talking about, are mountainous terrains where you're gonna like have foot infantry fighting with each other. Now they tell us, well, the Indian army is only half the size of China, right? Like 1 million to 2 million, because these are very large populations. Here's the problem with that argument. This necessarily creates a war of attrition like in World War I, with a deadlock with no clear winner the moment you have tons of soldiers going there, right? Because China will not want to waste its time fighting and trying to kill 1 million people in a terrain where it's extremely hard. But even if like China was stronger economically, the problem with that is India can still send soldiers, because just like Russia, just like China, soldiers are very cheap to recruit in these countries because the people are paid very low amounts, right? The income there is very low. That's the reason why even though the UK and France are way richer than Russia, their armies are still infinitely smaller than Russia, even though they're poor, because it's very cheap to hire these soldiers. So foot infantry battles can still exist on both sides of the house, and China cannot win that war based on attrition. But two, Indian troops currently have the geographical advantage, right? I don't think they've done their research, because right now China's army is sparsely populated across the mainland China, right? And they have to cross 4,000 meters of extremely mountainous terrain. India's soldiers are currently already at the border, right? And China will face massive supply issues if they decide to like fund their entire army and start bringing their soldiers over, right? And their army can't simply stay. The conclusion of this argument is that there is no active threat to India that makes them have to concede their territory in order to de-escalate tensions. But two, let's talk about the comparative and why you have more escalatory things on their side of the house and why more people die. Because they tell us China will never back down. Exactly, China will never back down. And why does that mean that you should? I think that was a burden they never failed to prove, right? Because we gave you a clear argument on appeasement that went totally unresponded to. Because right now, China is flexing its muscle, and once you give territory up, it will go further. Now they tell us, but China only wants China only wants territories which are historically significant. Here's the problem. Over 2,000 years, boundaries over like China and India are extremely blurred, right? There are so many shifting boundaries within China over the past 2,000 years. Just look at the South China Sea, right? This is a clear example of when China says, from the Qin Empire, we used to control this land from 500 years ago. So obviously, lots of part of India were used to be controlled by China in the past. I'm not talking about like mainland India, but northern India. These are once all controlled by the Qin Empire, not just the Gangang Valley and what they want to talk about, right? So obviously on their side of the house, China does have an incentive to push further into northern India and not simply stop at the Galwan Island. That necessarily means that on their side of the house, you have more escalatory tensions. But two, let's talk about the nature of these locations and why we cannot give them up. Because if we're talking about Ladakh, Tibet, Aksai Chin, like the Galwan Valley, these are all naturally defensible like terrains, and these are strategic locations because of their mountainous terrain, right? And it's very hard for China to fight a war there, and it's a very strategic location to defend India from the north. But what happens when you give this area up? Because I think we've proved that China does have an incentive to push further into India. That necessarily means that future conflicts are much more difficult to defend, right? Because your soldiers now don't have the natural defensible terrain. And that means that you get more deaths on your soldiers. But furthermore, because China now has a bigger incentive to attack your soldiers when you have less defenses, right? Because all of the terrain which is currently used right now by India to defend themselves is all gone. It's all controlled by China. That necessarily means that your soldiers are now defenseless and China has a bigger incentive to attack you, right? So that's when you get more lives lost on their side of the house. But three, we gave you a clear argument on why you lose other territories that went completely unresponded to by their side of the house. Because the narrative that is perpetuated on their side is that India is subservient, right? Because even if you still want to hold on into your current borders, right? They said, we're going to defend our current borders. When you have the narrative that India is subservient, this changes the calculus of China and Pakistan, right? These countries become infinitely more aggressive. And that's the moment, even if you want to defend your territory, they attack you more and more. And that's when you get more conflicts and more deaths on their side of the house. So if you want to defend the area on your side of the house, you have to defend it against an actor which is far more aggressive and has more frequent conflicts. I think that's when more deaths happen on their side of the house. Lastly, let's talk about the mood of Indian society right now. And this was something which was largely ignored by their side of the house. Because let me contextualize what India currently looks like. They voted for Modi, right? And the BJP party. What does this party stand for? It's an extremely nationalistic party, right? Two reasons as to why this is the case. One, you can look at the Muslim citizenship ban in India, right? Because you want to be pro-Hindu. Two, you can look at Kashmir and why Modi is currently using all his jets to bomb Kashmir and kills Pakistani citizens. This all points to the fact, and the Indian people all support Modi for this. This all points to the fact, I think you're out of order, that Indian society right now is extremely nationalistic. But what happens if Modi concedes territories to China? You were attacked by the opposition parties, you were attacked by the media, and the nationalistic people won't want to vote for Modi anymore. Why is this extremely harmful, and why was this the most important argument in this debate? Because they will vote for a party that promises revenge. They will vote for a party which says, we're going to reclaim the Galwan Valley, we're going to reclaim Ladakh, we're going to reclaim Aksai Chin, and we're going to push further into Chinese territory for revenge, right? Look at the 1930s. I think history often repeats itself. In Germany, the Weimar Republic accepted the Treaty of Versailles. They let French and Belgian troops into the Ruhr, and that's when the German people voted for Hitler, right? Because they have felt a desire for revenge, especially with contextualized Indian society, which is extremely nationalistic. What they will do is they will vote more retaliatory parties into power. And that is the moment you get more conflicts and more fights with China. That's the moment you get more deaths on their side of the house. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for that speech. Mistake just now, I just called member of GOV, whereas that was DLO. All right, now for the real member of GOV, you may take the floor.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Thank you very much. So, I think this framing of this debate is very simple. It's about the comparison about the costs and benefits. Closing government is first thing to specifically examine to what extent cost exists and to what extent benefit exists, and explicitly compare what benefits and overrides the cost. So with that being said, I'm going to talk about two things in this debate. First of all, I'm going to undercut the premise of the opposition side. Why China won't expand more, especially given the current context. I think OG was somewhat lazy in this point by asserting the Galwan Valley is inhabitable, so anyway China do not have incentive, despite the fact there is a regional, this territorial conflict exists between China and India. For the places like Kashmir, I think DAO was correctly pointed out. I think these kind, even with closing government, we say even in those instances, why China won't expand more, especially given the current context. And moreover, the closing government also depend on their model, like border protection by the military. We do not, we closing government also say even if that model don't work, China don't have incentive to expand more. Second of all, I'm gonna also talk about the long-term benefits, especially in terms of economy, how de-escalation will help the citizens of India. Notice more than 70% of workers in India is working for informal economy. They are underpaid fundamentally, and most of them are domestic immigrants coming from a remote area. I think these are the kinds of people which need help most in order to save life. We think improving the economy is the most important thing in this debate, given the context of India. All my rebuttals are integrated onto my first point. Let's undercut the premise of opening opposition. Closing government will explain analytically the analysis and structural incentive as to why China won't expand so much. But let's point out the clarification about the observation of DL speech. I think DL, especially the first part of their speech, is contradicting because they talk about China is trying to improve the U.S. relationship. They talk about the India's military is so strong, therefore the China won't be so aggressive. I think these are the kind of fundamental contradiction as their premises. But anyway, let's continue. Let's continue my analysis. 4 layers analysis here. First of all, United States is willing to intermediate these kind of conflict. If you look at the last March of Donald Trump visit for the India, the United States are trying to massively improving their relation with the India. Therefore, I think the United States are willing to intermediate. After the incident of 20 soldiers died, I think the United States published a statement about they are willing to intermediate. DO will say China do not want to screw up their relationship with the United States in terms of economy. That's the precise reason they won't expand. Second, China is struggling in their financing, especially in terms of One Belt One Road. One Belt One Road is unfortunately failing, especially due to the COVID-19 crisis, because many debts, many countries who are lending the debts are unable to pay the debts. Therefore, they are suspended most of them are suspended. In the last G20 summit, China decided to suspend the payment of the debt for 8 months of this year, and China is going to suspend more. We think the financing of One Belt One Road is fundamentally failing here. Therefore, China do not have financial capacity to expand more in order to have invest in military in order to expand the region. Furthermore, leader of opposition said China avoided global hatred. That's the point. In order to make One Belt One Road successful, China have to maintain a legitimacy to put many countries under their program of One Belt One Road, which means China do not want to lose a legitimacy by taking a stance of expansionism. Therefore, they are timid in the sense that they are not necessarily so much aggressive in terms of expansionism. First of all, COVID-19 decreased the global trade about 32%, which means China's merchandise sector, which is a huge sector in their economy, is massively damaged due to the decrease of global trade. We think these kind of supply chain problem is happening in the sense that China do not have the capacity to expand and radicalize this kind of war. These are the structural reasons. Even if our model do not work, even if we're talking about important critical points of a region like Kashmir, why the China's expansionism, i.e. the cost of this policy is small. I think these kind of, there is a structural reason as to show why this cost is so small. I think this is very important thing in this debate. No, thank you. On to the second point. Let's talk about the benefits compared to the cost. How de-escalation will help the citizens of India. Premise is China is pursuing expansionism according to the opening opposition, even though I do not think so. I do not think so. It is so seriously. But anyway, thus the escalation. If that is the case, the escalation will make the China antagonize with India. Given this, let's clarify what kind of power China is exerting over neighboring countries in the status quo. 2 layers analysis. First of all, as OJ has somehow correctly pointed out, they are doing the mask diplomacy, like exporting a ventilator and mask and sending the doctor. They are handling COVID-19 well. But because China is handling COVID-19 well, therefore they are doing so. But more importantly, they can exert economic power for neighboring country because China have a huge economic success. It has second highest GDP, and second most trade is oftentimes done with the neighboring countries. And also they also do the numerous amounts of trades with the neighboring nations and the status quo. They have a huge investment power, especially due to the One Belt One Road program. Thus, how this will help? No, thank you. We think economically these kind of things, these kind of concession will help massively for 3 years analysis here. First of all, for the first time by India showing a good face to China, India is going to be integrated into One Belt One Road program. which means A, they are going to connect it with the other nation. The transportation route about the commerce is going to increase. They're more interconnected with other nations. Therefore, their economy in terms of trade and commerce is going to be globalized. Second of all, there will be a foreign direct investment. At the war times, investors are timid because their investment is going to be screwed up after the investment. However, if they maintain a peaceful situation, I think the business is going to be, and more investors are going to invest their money into that area, into the region of India. Therefore, the business is going to increase. The number of employment is going to increase. Third of all, the infrastructure is going to establish. And these kind of infrastructure, especially due to the One Belt One Road program, China is going to invest a lot. No, thank you. Business can access to the infrastructure. Business can use the road, airports, and ports, which is inside the program One Belt One Road project. We think China is going to be charitable, especially in this aspect, because A, India has massive population, which is lucrative market for China. Second of all, we also say that, especially geographically, India is a critical point to access to the country, to mediate to the country, especially in the Southern Asia. We think these are the kinds of unique benefit India can provide. Therefore, by using these kind of bargaining chip in the negotiation, China is likely to make it charitable in that aspect. This is important because still, the more than 70% of labor force in informal sector, and moreover, inequality in India is a starting high. It is about, I forget a specific number, but I think it is a top 5 highest inequality exists in the world, I guess. Therefore, this is important because OG talk about short-term gain, like getting masks or not avoiding economic sanction or things like that. What closing government is talk about the long-term sustainable solution to benefit the Indian people. We think these are the kinds of things which is necessary. And more important than unlike speculative risk of China's expansionism, which I already disproved in my first argument. By this comparison, we think there's massively beneficial for the population of India, therefore beg to propose.
Hi, I'm so sorry. Is it okay if I use the toilet? I'll be back in 1 minute. So sorry.
All right, no problem.
Thank you.
Don't bring the camera to the toilet, okay now.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Thank you. In 3, 2, 1. Panel. 3 houses in this debate has been incredibly generic on a debate about Chinese influence. Government says, oh, conflict is bad plus COVID. Op says, oh, China will exploit and further push for more concessions. This conflict isn't just about India and China's clash. It's a clash with all global superpowers against China, and why specifically at this moment, India is in a unique position to capitalize on its increased opportunities of alliances to become the new regional superpower. Opposition alluded to this in one line, about Western support. We think we will further ground this with factual information and grounding as to why trend analysis will prove this is the case for this debate. First thing, I want to weigh in on will China exploit this further, but most notably, I think opening opposition lost this clash immediately when they said opening opposition literally knives themselves when saying China won't escalate to prevent war. I think based on that assumption, you also cannot assume the government will not have a world where China will further exploit new forces of land, because exploitation of new land necessarily necessitates an escalation of the conflict. Here's how I'll resolve it. We'll weigh in on actually proving the trend analysis that grounds China's realistic likelihood that proves that this is an active exploitation of the current pandemic as a whole. I think DPM gave a very good example in this debate about why during COVID-19, China actively started invading Spratly Islands and used COVID-19 to pass a legislation that strips Taiwan of and strips Hong Kong of its rights. I think uniquely, every single time they argue on their side of the house, it's mere reason that grounds the likelihood that China is actively exploiting the current situation for their own benefit. But second, expansionism has literally been in China's recent interest throughout the Spratly Islands, the building of landmass and the military bases throughout South China Sea. Government argues, on closing, they care about the image because they want people on the BRI. Guys, BRI isn't contingent on the image. China eats you up with that doesn't change on both sides of the house. But image is highly non-symmetrical at the point that you recognize China as an authoritarian regime, and they really never cared about alliances with the US. Anyway, they launched tariff wars against each other. I have no idea why China's need to pander to the US in this scenario. What does this mean? Note also that opening government had the burden to defend the scenario in which expansionism happened, because they literally said if you infringe upon more land, we will start militarily retaliating against you. So if they don't stop and you support military retaliation, you backtrack on all your principal concessions, because you are still going to have to incur all the harms of expanding military forces and hurting more people, even though that extra piece of land that China might pick up in your world is one in which has less net people dying, and that's your principle that you stand on. What does this mean? This means the clash of expansion boils down to the principle that states ultimately hold sovereignty as the principal determining factor as to whether they should do something or not. I think the clash has to be resolved in a world in which escalation does happen on both sides, on like in government's world, and how this opposition weigh that trade-off of lives with the increased benefits in the economy due to the alliance they can form with Western superpowers right now. On to the extension. We think India's in a unique position to capitalize upon the opportunity to become a regional superpower. Why is this the case? More specifically, here are factual information about the status quo. International recognition of India's claim to the land right now is pervading. This looks like US and UK, including Trump and Boris Johnson, literally voicing out their support for India, and throughout EU countries this happened as well. This is uniquely true because it isn't just extended to, oh, I will give you international media for support. A lot of these countries are actively funding India's military and giving funds through bilateral trade deals towards India right now to benefit them and aid them in the fight against China. Why is this structurally true in terms of analysis? Firstly, you would say that India is in a unique position in the Asian region to be the sole force that can combat China's increasing influence, and is precisely the reason why India has seen an increase in alliances, even though Modi is generally a pretty bad democratic leader, but comparatively he's still better than China, and hence UK, EU, and US as a whole are trying to ally up with India. Trump literally went to India and had a march in India as a whole, which gained international support for the alliance. We would say that's reason as to why these individuals are ones which are mutually beneficial. But what we will specifically prove is why de-escalation will cripple all existing political leverage India has on a global scale. Not specifically, the reason why these countries want India to help India right now is because their ability to combat China on two key levels. Politically, India is seen as a check and balance against China due to its strength in numbers and increasing influence in the region when it comes towards its increased trade capacities, its increased economy. But more than that, it's an increased level in in human resources, in its population becoming smarter and becoming more globalized in nature. But second, economically, India has more people than China. It is likely to be the new mass consumer market, and China's growing influence that trends towards expansionism is something that the West generally does not want anyway. More specifically, I would like to speak here that when opposing government argued that the economy is something of an issue, we would propose that China isn't the main dependence when it comes towards Indian economy. We'll just take this case at a worst case scenario, and China no longer helps India in trade. We'll propose that the active benefits that the current alliances have led to looks like bilateral trade deals and negotiating leverage when it comes towards trade. It looks like balancing the asymmetry of power, which previously would never have existed under both sides of the house because they had no reason to support India right now, but more specifically, now they do. What this means is that India has a unique opportunity to capitalize on these new alliances, make more money through those trade deals, and that eventually balance out China's reliance anyway. We don't think that argument on economy is one that's extremely detrimental. Before I move on, I'll take opening government.
So there's clearly a difference in scale between a densely populated area like Galwan and an actual city. Even if you win the war, you still kill millions of sides on either side. Explain the actual likelihood of China actually involving itself into an Indian city.
Yeah, China will, because literally both sides of the house have to argue escalation in order for your impacts to materialize, guys. This debate is not assuming, and we literally grounded the trend as to why China is expanding. We proved to you the exploitation of COVID-19 into expansionism right now. You give us no structural trend to prove why your claim is true anyway. But onto this main contention as to why they do not want India to de-escalate. This is a means of combating China's growing influence in the Asian region. I think it's extremely unnuanced for side government to say, oh, it's just one piece of land that's really not valuable. I think when Jerome literally said, guys, this allows China to control water sources, I propose that that's a pretty strong benefit that countries would probably want to use, right? But more more than that, I think it's incredibly unnuanced to assume that one piece of land and China expanding onto this piece of barren land ends there in and of itself. Guys, there are massive signaling effects as to what the outcomes can be, specifically when China is trying to expand its dominance throughout the Asian region. What does this signaling effect look like? This trickles down to every single other conflict that China is currently having towards expansionism. This crushing of Taiwan, its take of Hong Kong, Spratly Islands and throughout South China Sea, the building of land masses and military bases. If India, the one country that's propped up by all Western allies right now, is conceding to China at this unique juncture, it gives more legitimacy to China to further oppress all these smaller countries, and it gives more legitimacy for these smaller countries to go, I shouldn't fight China, because even India, with the support of the US, is something that they cannot beat. We would propose that as of the status quo, maybe you would get more deaths, and the status quo would probably be one where some bloodshed exists. But at the very least, you're able to combat that when you're actively having the support of international allies that stretches beyond the US all the way to Europe in terms of funding your military, in terms of aiding on an international level. But more importantly, you don't open a can of worms of trying to further exploit their current power, and you actively create a check and balance on a global scale. We are very proud to propose this debate.
All right, thank you, member of COP. Now to end the Gov bench, I'll call upon the Gov whip.
CEO's analysis actually helps our side, because the reason why USA and UK is not supporting India right now is because because Modi in the last summit, when Trump offered to make compromise, offered to be the mediator of the negotiation, he said, no, I'm not going to make compromise. That's why under status quo, there's no support from USA. That's why negotiation is difficult right now. But when we say we are willing to make compromise, that's when Trump has incentive to help India, and that's the factual reality that CEO misses. That's why CEO's analysis actually help our side, because negotiation is not going to be power imbalance as they say, because USA is going to be mediator. This is what Trump said. This is the likely scenario that they need to engage with. First, let's talk about why we go over opening government. There's two reasons for this. Firstly, opening government relied on this very short-term scenario of COVID-19 without never telling us why this has to be China, and without never telling us why it's going to be impactful at the end of the day. We told you a more long-term impact about joining One Belt, One Road policy, joining economic cooperation with China is much more beneficial, given that we are able to have a sustainable economy, given that we are able to gain things like infrastructure investment, which means that we are able to gain foreign investment, which is going to be a cycle of better economy within our side of the house. But secondly, we solve the deadlock of the other side of the debate. That is whether negotiation is going to be India favor or China favor. We are going to prove to this by firstly, we told you how China has incentive to care about its position. But secondly, we told you the unique power and negotiation chip that India has. And third of all, CEO's mechanism about USA actually helps our side to prove this. So let's first talk about how negotiation is likely to have. Opening opposition and also closing opposition assume that China will have a disproportionate power within the negotiation, which lacks so much nuance within this debate. Firstly, we tell you that it is actually going to be better when USA is likely to happen. The thing is, Donald Trump in the last conference with Modi, he said that he is willing to be the mediator between this conflict, and he is willing to be the help negotiation of Modi. But at this point, Modi said no. But when we change this as the motion suggests, and when we change this to compromise stance, it's going to mean that Donald Trump is likely to help our negotiation. Why is this? And this is something CEO conceded. Why is this important? Firstly, because USA is a superpower. Yes, USA has impact a lot of goods within economic China, and as they conceded, trade war, even if trade war is happening, China still cares about USA, and they cannot ignore the existence of USA because they rely so much economic benefit and trade benefit on USA. That's why they are likely to listen to the mediation, and a compromise is likely to happen when we have China, when we have Donald Trump as a mediator. US has incentives to do this, firstly because it is geopolitical speaking, as MO conceded, they want to maintain the stability within the region, and they also want to acquire economic benefit. That's why they have incentives to do that, especially given that India is an important base within South Asia. But third of all, when India gets close to China, that incentivize US to care more about India, because they don't want India to be China's side. That's why we are able, by making compromise to China, we are able to balance out the international relationship and incentivize USA to help outside. That's why negotiation will not be power imbalance as opposition bench assumes. But secondly, even if we assume that USA does not help, why is China still has incentive to do so? MO told us we didn't really have any structural analysis, but they don't engage with the nuance analysis and incentive structure that was there from MO. Firstly, we told you that they want to keep legitimacy, as LO conceded, China care about global reputation. But second, as the LO conceded, China wants to be the economic hegemony of the country, especially One Belt, One Road policy requires many countries' cooperation. They want many countries to join as much as possible so they can connect different countries using infrastructure. That is only possible when they are able to have legitimacy and gain support from other individuals. That's why, for example, after criticism in the case of Sri Lanka and Pakistan, Xi Jinping improved the situation, such as decreasing the interest rate, such as improving the deal. We think that Xi Jinping has incentive to do that. Well, that's why, for example, when Southeast Asian country was like making compromise with like land disputes, China has incentive. China giving economic gain was able to make compromise. That is the factual realities that they need to engage with. But even if this is not true, there's uniqueness of India, which is different from other countries. Firstly, because as they consider, India has a huge population and large economy. That's why China has incentive to invest to this country and cooperate with them. B, India is not democratic. It's not so democratic as they concede, which means that China don't have to care about human rights issues. But third of all, because they have geopolitically important position within the country. If you look at where India is, it is in the middle of like South Asia and in India Sea, which means that it is a geopolitically important position for these people. This was considered by DLO when they say when there was contradiction in DLO speech when they say India has weak power, but but on the other hand, they say India do have a strong power to make negotiation, and that is why this negotiation is likely to happen. Why is this important? Firstly, because it solves the deadlock of the other side of the house, which is the fundamental premise whether the negotiation will work. We told you structural analysis and the mechanization and the case study to prove why this is going to work. Therefore, vast majority of their arguments, such as exploitation, such as expansion, such as oppression of Muslim camp within this region, will not happen in the first place. That's why their premise falls down within this debate. Second, let's talk about the economic cooperation. The context we need to understand here is that 70% of the work is under informal sector, and India economy is in a devastating situation right now. But second of all, because it is conflict, because they have political conflict right now, China and India cannot cooperate because they have to be consistent to their citizens, and that's why when we have this political conflict, we cannot do this. But when we make compromise, we are not fighting anymore, which means a one belt, one road policy or economic cooperation becomes possible only in outside of the house when the conflict ends. We told you about the network effect, how it is going to gain like foreign investment. We told you how China are going to invest lots of infrastructure, which is a premise for economy to function or the investment to come in the first place. This is a huge benefit on the ground. But why is China better than other actors? Firstly, because China is more straightforward. CCP is a solid one party that wouldn't change their stance, which means that when we have negotiation once, we are able to keep that sustainable relationship. But secondly, China is a more traditional global sense, and they want to expand. They want to like gain cooperation with other countries, and they want to expand this. This only happens between outside of Sahara, and because China is a predictable actor, it's actually a very strategic stance for India to rely on this individual rather than other Western countries. Because we told you the premise, because we told you the economy, proud to propose.
All right, thank you, Government Whip, for that speech. And now to end the debate, I call upon the Opposition Whip. Here.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Chad, the main portion of the debate is this. The government team saying that China will win and opening opposition saying that India will win. Keio was the only team that expanded the debate. What did we do? Two things. Firstly, we expanded the debate to a global scale because it is a global conflict. Secondly, we are the only comparative side in this debate because we will tell you, even in the improbable event that India loses the conflict, why it's still far beneficial than if they concede, right? Understanding that, what are we going to do now? I think it's regrettable that this has to come from Keio, but nevertheless, we'll do it. In order to win this debate, Keio will tell you what are India's best interests. It will tell you why we therefore win the debate. Firstly, to gain dominance as an Asian, the best way to do this is to garner stronger allyship, and that's not with China. And thirdly, to stand up to China as an agent, as a global hegemony, right? Understanding that, go into rebuttals. Firstly, OG. OG said that China will continue to overpower India. The examples he gave were Tibet and Hong Kong. This is different because note, these were weak powers with an inability to protect themselves, an inability to resist. Even if they did, it was doomed to fail. We tell you this is different because of all the analysis we didn't give you, right? And I'll recap that later. Secondly, they made a major contradiction, right? Because first they said if there was no concessions made by India, China will spark a full-out war. They will utilize, they'll send in millions of soldiers, they'll use nukes. But in the same breath, they also told us that China is a rational actor that won't want war and will recognize India as a valuable actor, and that's why they won't expand. Note that there's a large contradiction. Next, CG, right? So first thing they said is China won't want to expand, and they gave so many reasons. OBO is failing, economically suffering, China wants to improve relations with the US. All of this is factually untrue, but even if it is, then I don't see why China then wants to further contesting in the Sino-Indian conflict, right? Secondly, they said India will be integrated into OBO, and that's beneficial. This is harmful because OBO ends up screwing up countries with weak economies. And secondly, all the infrastructure and economy is only for short term, just like Sri Lanka. India will end up in mounds of debt. But even if OBO is good, this is still not in India's best interest, right? Because India doesn't want to concede to China in the first place, and integrating into OBO is a huge concession on India's part that would destroy relations with Western allies. CG's entire case is premised on negotiations between India and China being fair. So they said that US will want to be the mediator, right? This is just untrue. US doesn't want to negotiate with China. US wants India to overpower China. They want that's why they're supporting India, right? And even without US, if China is so overwhelmingly powerful as all government benches have said, then this negotiation is going to be unfair from the get-go, right? We tell you this is harmful. And note that CG is entirely unresponsive to how concessions by India would obliterate its global status. Understanding that, moving on to issues. Firstly, why it's in India's best interest to keep contesting. We understand that the OO said this, but we gave you structural analysis and examples, right? Firstly, we tell you international community is supporting India. This looks like US, Britain, and Western powers funding India, providing international media attention, creating bilateral trade deals. And secondly, we tell you that China is very stretched thin, right? The military is spread out in Spratly Islands, South China Sea Islands, and military bases in South Korea, right? Understanding that India is more likely to win, we tell you what the benefits of this. Firstly, we tell you it's a symbol of global dominance, a sign that India is a rising global power, a rising global hegemony. We told you this is the best interest of India. Secondly, we tell you grants accessibility to allyship, such as Western powers that whose interests are to keep China at bay as a check and balance toward China. Before I move on, sure.
If it is true that India is not a weak power and it still has backing from foreign powers, why can't we just defend India after giving up the Gawan Valley? What is the crushing effect of losing the Gawan Valley?
Okay. That moves me on to my second issue, why India making concessions is so harmful for global status. Firstly, it legitimizes China as a hegemony. We understand that OO said this, but we'll tell you what exactly this looks like. India is by far the most powerful and capable actor in order to stand up to China and challenge the Chinese hegemony. The point which you concede, it means you recognize that you no longer can. It means three things, right? Firstly, China feels more confident about its global hegemony. Secondly, China is willing to further expand its territory, not necessarily India, but also militarizing other contested areas, such as Tibet, such as Hong Kong, such as islands in South China Sea, right? Thirdly, they're likely going to further their global capture through things like OBO, where they're able to like dominate smaller countries with weaker economies. Secondly, what Wee-Ern told you that's completely new from CO, right? We told you lose allyship with Western powers. What does this look like? Western powers lose faith in India. The reason is they allied with India on the purpose that India can contest China. So this looks like funding, like support, like international media attention and bilateral trade deals between Western powers and India. All these are contingent on India standing up to China and India being able to contest the Chinese hegemony. What happens when you concede is this: UK and US lose faith in India's ability to combat China. They're likely going to look for other Asian powers that are going to contest China. They lose faith. India's economy is severely damaged. Thirdly, India is now on a slippery slope to losing power. Again, OO said this, but we'll tell you exactly why. In the short term, India is going to lose the negotiation, because if it's true that China is so overwhelmingly powerful, the negotiation is only going to be one-sided, because we tell you that they have no leverage and they're lower end of negotiating table. China is going to keep contesting borders. China is going to keep militarizing contested areas, and we tell you that's just harmful, right? Before I move on, sure.
China only invades areas in which it thinks it has claim over. Examples like the Spratly Island and the Sino borders, because there's a moral border, there's a gray moral area, there's a gray area in those borders that they can invade. Why would they invade a 100% sovereign state they have no claim over?
Yeah, so it starts as China contesting like morally gray areas, but eventually they're going to contest more and more borders because they claim over it, because they're expansive in nature, right? And they want to increase their hegemony in Asia and in the globe, right? But moving on to comparatives, even in the unlikely event that India loses, this is what CO tells you exclusively. Firstly, you're able to maintain allyship with Western actors, because UK and US and EU will still support you because you continue to fight against China and you continue to contest the global hegemony. Tell you these Western powers are a much preferable actor to trade compared with China, as CG suggested, because for a few reasons, right? China's OBO is eventually going to screw countries like Sri Lanka and eventually India up, and China is like very like self-preservative in nature. We tell you US and UK and EU countries as trade actors are much more preferable. But secondly, it's a scale, right? So in our world, some concessions, we make some concession that China is stronger, but it's a scale. In our world, we try in the conflict but lose, and maybe perhaps we do some damage to China in terms of economy and in terms of global status. But the inevitable comparative is, in your world, you actively concede that China is stronger from the day one. And we tell you this is harmful, right? So we give you a multitude of reasons why you lose your status as a rising Asian hegemony. You're unable to gain economic might, because even if in a likely event you want to ally with China in terms of like trade, we tell you lose any support from the West that's currently propping India up. For all those reasons, now I'm prouder to oppose.